Right. So next I want to talk about California's urban landscapes. So uh, we have urban areas, major ones in California, such as then the Bay Area in Southern California. They're what we might call nucleated, like they're kind of, around a main kind of nucleus or center. These are non-agricultural areas generally, and they have more complicated economic activities. They are usually beyond primary activities. So rather than agriculture, they might have manufacturing, or even more still, tertiary or services. And just a little background, when we talk about how urban areas evolve, that, people at one time, lived primarily on farms, but you might have what's called a hamlet, little rural settlement with a few people together. But they need specialized services. They need a vet, they need a dentist, things like that. So you might have the development of a village with some specialized services, but as populations grow and you need more and more specialization, you start to become a city or an urban area. And those form around what's called a central business district, which is kind of a fancy word for a downtown, and then a development of connecting suburbs around that central business district. So a little more detail on that. So cities provide services for large hinterland. That's the area surrounding the city that is not part of the city. So for Fresno, it would be the agricultural zone that surrounds Fresno would be Fresno's hinterland. That for people who live in, say, Mendota or Sanger or other out in the country near Fresno would come into Fresno to go to the dentist or get their taxes done or what have you. And in some places, we see some good examples of California of what's called conurbation. Conurbation is where cities grow together to form large urban areas. So if you've ever driven through the Bay Area or the Southern California, Los Angeles area, you don't know where one city starts and one city begins. It goes on and on and on and on. And so that's what a conurbation is. There's no clear definition of the end of one urban area and the beginning of the other. They just sort of grow and mold into each other. Fresno Clovis is not a good example of that, but it's just a minor one. So you can't, Fresno and Clovis have grown together, but a conurbation would be more like the Los Angeles or San Francisco Bay Area, and even San Diego area as well. So what do we have cities? They provide professional and personal services, wholesale and retail centers. California's number one in a lot of things, but also with retail, California's the #1 state for retail sales. And we have things like flagship stores in cities. Those are in the largest cities like LA and San Francisco, you have these like the Apple store or an Amazon stores. Things of that are very specialized. And other cities just have other kinds of specialty stores. This is called the Hemp Shack in Fresno. And if you're a city of above a certain size, there are many kind of very specialized stores that can operate because you have a large enough population to support them. If you're a very small town, you might only have basic things like a Walmart, which is a non-specialized store. The bigger you are, the more specialized stores can become. Now, one way that we can kind of look at this, try to explain the size of different cities, there's something called central place theory. And this is the idea that of trying to explain how consumer services are distributed over space. So the idea is that each city has a range of where people will go to shop there or have services there. And if you kind of form them into these hexagons, you can have one for each city. And then there might be a bigger city in between that offer services for many others. So in this example, this big hexagon would be for a bigger city, and the smaller hexagons would be for a smaller town. So for example, this bigger one might be for Fresno, and Fresno perhaps can have a type of store that Clovis can't. So the smaller one might be Clovis. And so Clovis people don't drive as far to go shop in Clovis as they do to shop in some of the major retailers in Fresno, like River Park and Fashion Fair. Not as many people drive as far to go to the Sierra Vista Mall. And so there's technical terms for this. You can have what's called a range of services. How far are people willing to travel to go to it? So, I mean, how far are you willing to go to get a pizza or burger or pants? There's differences. You might drive a lot further to get a pair of pants than you would to go get a burger. And often it's not in linear distance, but just how long it takes to get there. So you can, driving on Highway 99 is a lot different than if you're just going across town. And there's also something called the threshold of service, how many people you need to have to support it. So Fresno has this big hexagon or circle because there's a, you know, it can support things like a Macy's, for example, because there's enough people in this region to support having a Macy's, where in Clovis, perhaps it's too small to support a Macy's store. And one thing that we can define in an urban area is the CBD, or Central Business District. It's a more precise way of describing what we often call a downtown. It's the best known, most recognizable part of the city, and usually it's easy to access from the rest of the region. And usually these types of areas attract stores that have a high threshold, that there's enough people to support the store, or with a long range where people will travel very far. So the downtowns generally are places that have very specialized types of stores that people will either travel a long way to, or the city is big enough that they can support a very specialized type of store. And they also have some shops just for the people who live and work in that area as well. Now, defining the CBD, or Central Business District, it's easier in a small town. It's kind of clear to see what the downtown of a small town is. But when you get into these complicated urban areas like Bay Area and Los Angeles, it can be more difficult in these conurbations. Well, one thing that's typical in larger cities is there's high land costs. The Central Business District typically is expensive. And that's why the buildings are so tall, because it's expensive to build a tall building, but if the land cost is high enough, it makes it worth your while to build upward rather than outward, because building outward costs you a lot of money. And it also the cost also precludes some activities like manufacturing or residential, because it could be that apartments are so expensive that that land is so expensive that it's really not economically viable to build like a neighborhood with houses, because the houses would be so expensive people wouldn't want to buy them. Same thing with large manufacturing plants. Those take up a large amount of space, and so those tend to be outside of the downtown or CBD. And so this process of moving businesses outside of the Central Business District is called suburbanization. So businesses have moved largely outside of this Central Business District because they're driven by lower land costs, so they can afford, it's more affordable, and because a lot of their customers have moved there. So as people have moved out to the suburbs like Clovis and North Fresno, businesses have followed them along as well. So shopping, restaurants, that sort of thing. One thing about suburbs that's different than a downtown is they often don't have a corner store. That the transportation is really more about cars. So we have shopping malls, places where people would drive to rather than places people would walk to, and it's like you would have in a city like San Francisco. Same goes with factories and offices. They are often large, so they go outside of the Central Business District to find cheaper land and better access to freeways, easier transportation. And then in some cases, they may not need to have face-to-face contact. You can have large call centers that can easily move out to a non-urban area. So just to wrap up this part, so we have a central city and we have suburbs. And the suburbs, they often are initially dependent on the city, that the area around downtown Fresno would be dependent on downtown Fresno, but eventually they can evolve into their own urban realm. That, for example, North Fresno, you could live in North Fresno and never have to go downtown. You could probably get by with, because there are enough services and government offices and shopping, restaurants, that there are some people who live in North Fresno who hardly ever go downtown because they don't really have to, because North Fresno kind of operates as its own urban realm. And then beyond the suburbs, you can have suburbs of suburbs. And we call those exurbs. These are residential areas that go beyond the suburbs of a city. So the ranchos, for example, in Madera County, these are areas that are beyond the suburbs of Fresno or Madera that would be where people live, that are kind of way out in beyond there. Or even east of Clovis, where you get into these ranch areas, and they're not really urban, they're just kind of these small ranches where people live. These would be the exurbs of a city.